Hi, everyone. My name's Nick. I'm the president of Europe, formerly president of Asia Pacific as well. But over the past year and a half, we've been really focusing on Europe, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why that is. So at AMZ Advisors, we've been doing expansions for the past 5 or 6 years, more or less, and basically we go into accounts and for sellers that have already expanded, and I see so many problems. So maybe we could just take a pause. We just talked about expanding to Japan. We talked about expanding to the US. A lot of these things are going to be overlapping, but as Nick mentioned, Europe in particular tends to have a lot of small complexities, I'll call them, that could sometimes slow down your expansion process. So what I've worked on for the past 18 months is developing a solution to just do expansions better before you even send your first unit to Europe. I have about 15 phone calls a week with people who want to go to Europe, and there's just so many strategies that aren't fully thought through. So what I want to do right now is kind of walk through all of the things that you might need to consider before you actually make a European expansion. So the first thing to note is that post-Brexit, Amazon EU, which encompasses the Amazon UK and the mainland EU, is still run by Amazon EU completely, which confuses some sellers. However, you really need to think about these two different marketplaces as being separate when it comes to logistics, importing, and even VAT numbers. You really need to look at these two separately. So these days, when we're talking about expansion to Europe, we talk about the EU5, which are the UK, Germany, France, Spain, and Italy. However, we have a separate conversation about the UK because when it comes to warehousing, logistics, importing, you need to have two separate strategies, just to be clear about that. And that's a question I get a lot from sellers these days because it used to be a lot easier. So our first step normally when we're working with brands is your product going to be successful? A lot of expansions are done just thinking, hey, our product was doing pretty well in the US. We want to make more money. We want to expand to more marketplaces. So one of the first things we do is a pre-screening assessment. We actually assess all of the demand across Europe in these marketplaces to see if your product's going to be successful once you arrive there. There's nothing worse than spending 6 to 8 months planning an expansion, getting to Europe and realizing that you can't sell American coffee in Italy because Italian consumers just won't buy it. Or if you're selling snacks, for instance, and you try to go to the Italian market, they're really, really big on kitchen supplies and homeware, but not so much on actually buying consumables on Amazon yet, as people tend to go to the grocery store. And so one of the first things we do is we actually just do a review of your product, and we assess these markets and the demand for these markets to see if you're actually going to be successful. So if you come to me and you want to expand to Europe, I'm going to tell you before we even get to all the other steps if this is even a viable solution for you to generate more income and have a profitable endeavor. The next thing we do is we assess the demand from the EU5, the countries I mentioned before, and we're really trying to develop almost a pre-strategy and understanding what your roadmap looks like from 0 to 12 months later. So we actually forecast for you our predictions of how well the product will do with the best practices when it comes to SEO and advertising in all 5 of the big EU markets. Again, this is it's quite labor intensive, but in my opinion, I heard Dano mention it and Mike mentioned it as well. It's probably the most important thing, market research before you go, but even more important, forecasting, because we talk so much about market research, but if you can't actually put a number on what your ROI is going to be, it's extremely difficult to financially decide whether an expansion even makes sense for you. Even if your product sells, are you actually making money at the price points that European buyers are going to pay for your product? So the second step for us is actually forecasting sales and building what I'm going to call a pre-roadmap, which is understanding the niche markets that exist across the EU5 and what percentage of penetration you would need into these markets taking a quick look at the cost of ads and the PPC bids to understand if this is even something that's going to be profitable for you. The next step is partnerships. And, Nick brought up partnerships about how, they have over 1,000 partnerships. I would say for sellers that want to expand, I could count on my hand how many sellers we've worked with successful expansions that had all the necessary resources internally in their company. So we do something called a partnership audit, not to be confused with the software that Nick is talking about. This is merely conversations about what the internal resources of your brand look like and what we would need to co-op your expansion with. All of the most successful expansions to Europe involve partners. And so I've done my due diligence over the past year to develop a partnership network that allows us to seamlessly introduce you to people who can help you every step of the way. So some of these partners include VAT, which is an obvious one. You need to be VAT registered and have your VAT compliance just figured out and organized. Just recently, only 4 months ago, Amazon EU had a huge crackdown on VAT compliance and deactivated hundreds of accounts across Europe for foreign sellers that weren't VAT compliant. And so that's easily the most important thing to do. And sometimes, depending on the country you're applying for VAT in, it could take a little bit of time. So that's something that you definitely need to have good partners who know what they're doing to help you with. The second thing is who's going to import the product. As I mentioned, UK and mainland EU, unfortunately or fortunately, which I'll talk about later, you need to have separate importers of record in both of these places now. And that's one of the biggest solutions that I've been working on this past year, is to find really, really good partnerships that for people who can help you import your product without even filing for an LLC, which is called indirect representation, having a company that will help you basically bring the product in before it arrives at the Amazon warehouse. Third, warehouse partnerships. A lot of people have this idea that they're going to do FBA when they come to Europe. And I say, yes, FBA is the way to go. However, that doesn't mean that there isn't a need for 3PLs. I think Amazon warehouse space is becoming increasingly limited in the US, but eventually will be in Europe as well. So having strong partnerships with warehouses is something that we help you with. Another thing is a lot of really good expansions to Europe I see are from sellers who are drip feeding from a warehouse into the FBA center after doing a bigger import into the UK or into the EU. So meaning that you don't want to send a bunch of smaller shipments if you have to worry about importing the product into the UK and Europe every 4 months, just keep sending shipments. Some people prefer to do big pallet shipments, import everything at once to the country, find a 3PL partner, and then slowly drip feed inventory into the FBA centers. If that can get organized well, we've seen that to be a really fantastic setup, and maybe you have some less worries about sending new stock and having to go through the entire process again of sending it and importing the product. And so there's a handful of partnerships. We actually have a long list of needs. The other one that comes to mind though is compliance. Japan, is very strict and has some lab testing for particular products. The US is a little bit looser and has the FDA. Europe is somewhere in the middle. And this is where there's probably the most confusion from sellers I speak with about whether they're going to be what the compliance regulations are for the products they sell. And I wish I could say that there's an easy answer to this, but in Europe, every country has slight variations of how they approach compliance as well. So one of the things that we try to do really early on is determine what your target home base country is going to be in mainland EU using pan-European FBA. And making sure that the products are compliant in that marketplace, and connecting you with partners who could really help you make sure that from labeling, how you're packaging the product, and anything else you need to know before you actually send those products to the country and an FBA center. And so partnerships, it's a big part of it. We actually spent 3 weeks just figuring out all the resources you're going to need to have a successful expansion. Now, later in the webinar, I'll talk about why I think this is a good thing. Like Nick said, the percentage is actually kind of mind-boggling when you think about it, that there's only 2% of, there's only 2% of US FBA sellers selling on pan-European U in Europe.
Exactly. That's the case.
And one of the things we've noticed is when we get this right, once we get to Europe, once we get by the barrier to entry, the opportunity is great. It's not as competitive a market because so many people look at Europe and they're like, they probably listen to all the things I just said and they're like, maybe next year, and they wait. Coming back to why we're doing this, we basically want to make a blueprint as easy as possible for you guys. So before you even expand abroad, you actually know exactly what it looks like, how much of an ROI you can potentially get, all of the partnerships that you'll need before you send your first unit to Europe. And lastly, we develop a full strategy of what the first 6 months looks like in that marketplace, including PPC strategies, SEO strategies, and how to approach optimization and advertising across Europe when you have one European home marketplace. So that, I don't know if I was as quick as Mike was, but yeah, that's pretty much how we're thinking about expansions to Europe.